Brushfires ravaging Australia, rising tensions and tragedy in Iran, tumultuous politics everywhere. It can be difficult to remain hopeful when the world seems so chaotic. It can even lead to a kind of existential dread that makes it hard to face the day. Here for some insight into depression and anxiety brought on by global events seemingly beyond our control, we welcome Katie Hayes, a climate change and mental health researcher, and Steve Jordaens, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and we are delighted, even though the subject matter is somewhat grave, delighted to welcome you two back for some help for those who are finding it a difficult time to be an engaged citizen in the world. We mentioned, Steve, off the top, a couple of stories that have been very prominent in the headlines as of late. Events that don't seem to have anything in common with each other and which are pretty much beyond the scale of individuals to do anything about. What would be the normal human response to news like this when you hear it for the first time?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's sort of two levels we can talk about it. One is the kind of stress anxiety level, and the other is kind of the depression level. So on the stress level, we have this system that is in place to help us deal with threats. But this system assumes the threats are short term. So it assumes a predator has emerged from a bush or something like that, and that kicks in what's called our sympathetic nervous system. It makes our heartbeat faster, makes us strong and energetic, and makes us want to fight or flee. But the idea is we fight or flee, and it's done. When it's a chronic threat like this, that system stays engaged on a chronic level as well, at a lower level, but it's continually producing stress and anxiety, and that in turn can lead to health issues of the sort that can be physical as well.
We'll follow up, such as what?
Well, I mean, a lot of the work was done by Hans Selye, where he looked at just things like how sensitive you are to flus, to colds, to viruses, to things. Your immune system basically gets taxed if this system is active for too long. And that just makes you much more open to all sorts of health issues, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Brushfires, Australia, have been in the news virtually every day. Mm-hmm. It's probably the most dramatic example of the effects of climate change that we have seen maybe ever, but certainly in a very, very long time. What do you think the normal, appropriate human response to seeing that is?
Well, I think that many people are feeling distressed, anxious, worried, concerned about the future, concerned about their present state. And so we're having these very terrifying reactions to an event that does seem out of our control.
And half a world away.
And half a world away. But for many people here at home in Canada, we may feel the resonance with the wildfires we've experienced in the prairies. And so that can be very triggering for many people who've been exposed to similar events, and to see this time and time again in the news and seeing what is happening in Australia and then wondering what our future is going to be like under a changing climate.
What to you feels like a human response that borders on unhealthy?
So that's a very interesting question, because when we think of our mental health, it exists on a spectrum, of course. And so, yes, we have what are considered normal or typical responses to abnormal events. And then there's also atypical responses. So things like there's a case in Melbourne, Australia in 2009 of a 17-year-old boy who refused to drink water anymore because of his concerns over climate-related drought. And so that affected his day-to-day livelihood. And so that was considered a pathology. And so I think it's important that when we consider, does this affect our day-to-day lives? Does it affect our abilities to get up and go to work? Those are when we have to start to really gain some concern over these anxieties and these fears really taking over our lives, and they can become more of these pathologizing experiences.
I guess, Steve, you could argue that a 17-year-old young man whose brain has not fully developed, teenagers might be particularly susceptible to more emotional than less emotional reactions to what's going on. Are there other people on that list?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure anybody's really immune. There may be a more or less. There's another sort of insidious thing that happens. If you think of humanity at its best, say when we're going to the moon, so aspirational kinds of things, those are marked by what we call empowerment. Humans feel like we can do this, and that is a very strong positive emotion. When we're constantly exposed to some sort of trauma repeatedly, that can erode that. In fact, there's some really interesting experiments done in the 60s on a concept called learned helplessness. And I'm an animal lover, I'm an animal ethics guy, so I hate to tell this story, but I'll tell the story anyway. It was research done with dogs. They would put them in a compartment that had a divider, and early on the divider was low. And a light would come on. Shortly after light came on, the floor under the dogs would electrify. So the dogs would quickly learn, light comes on, escape and go over it. But then they raised the barrier. So they prevented the dog from escaping. And so the dog would see the light come on. Originally, it would sort of try to escape, but at some point, it would stop trying. It would sit in the corner and take the shock.
Because it felt helpless.
It felt helpless. And in fact, if you actually remove the barrier, it continues to stay there. So it's learned this feeling like I cannot control the things that are happening to me in life. And that's, so we say the locus of control has moved to an external, where things just happen. I have no control over it. And when that happens, that's a hallmark of depression. That's where people start to feel, literally powerless. And that happens to anybody.
It does, because I understand that an animal under test circumstances may feel that way, but humans, who presumably are more intellectual and can see that the barrier has been raised and I do have options, even we learn that helplessness as well.
Potentially in a barrier situation, obviously, we might do something where we could see it. But imagine someone who's tried to quit smoking 3 times and may come to the opinion that I just can't do this, or weight loss attempts, or anything like that, where somebody can try something, and if after a few attempts it doesn't work, they can just give up that power. And maybe there's a new way to do things or whatever, but they may just stop even exploring, and they may just accept, I can't do this. I'm going to smoke the rest of my life.
Katie, for those who, let's take the Brushfires, for example, again. For those people who have been just glued to the television set, trying to find out every scrap of information they can about Australia, and, maybe they make a contribution, or maybe they do something to try to ameliorate the situation, whatever they can do. If they feel overwhelmed by it all, what should they do?
Well, I think that's a common feeling. We want to be able to do something about it. Again, that sense of control and ability to support and help. And I think for many of us, we feel like, okay, we've done that donation, but we still don't feel better. And the situation is not improved. So what do we do now? And I think it's really important to stay engaged, and also to really focus on our own self-care as well, because we know continuously watching the news and seeing these stories, especially for people who've been exposed to a similar event or who may have predisposed mental health issues as well, it can be very triggering for them. So it's really important to find that balance, and that balance will be different for everyone, to really find how they can keep themselves well, but also keep active and engaged in the issue, because this isn't going to go away. When the cameras stop rolling in Australia and that's no longer the news story of the day, there's still going to be wildlife and humans and infrastructure that's going to take years and years and years to rebuild.
I'm interested that you say we have to stay engaged, because I don't want to tell you how many people I've spoken to over the past 3 years who say things such as, Trump makes me so crazy, I get home, I can't watch CNN. I just have to turn it off, because I've literally heard people say, it's bad for my mental health to be exposed to this train wreck, hour after hour after hour. But you say stay engaged?
Well, I think it's really important, because especially when we're talking about the issue of climate change, for example. So staying engaged really can help prompt some of that activism. So, some of the remarks that I often get is, isn't climate denialism one of the biggest issues of our time? And I say, well, yes, there are indeed climate deniers, but there are very few. What the real issue is climate disavowal, which is seeing the problem with one eye open and then closing the other eye and wanting to turn off the TV, distance ourselves, create that space and not see because it feels overwhelming. But that not seeing can also prompt inaction. And how are we going to address the issue is by getting engaged and is by taking some form of action.
Isn't, at some level, Steve, disengagement self-preservation that you have to do?
Yeah, I think so. There's that saying, have the wisdom to know the things you can change and the things you can't. And I think in the case of something like the environmental issue, hopefully we have not given up on that yet. I've heard a lot of people, espousing, here's little things you can do. I've never been a little thing person. I've been more a big thing person, like, put solar panels on every new house that's built, get rid of gas-powered vehicles. Like, there are some big things we could do. But there's things we could do. When it comes to something like Donald Trump, he is so random, he is so seemingly uncontrollable, that I think we do all need a break from him, because I don't know if there's anything any of us can do that will change that situation. And so in cases like that, it is certainly true that becoming mindful, literally realizing how much of the thoughts I'm having every day are negative thoughts. If you have too many negative thoughts, you are going to steer towards depression, and that is a hallmark again of depression.
So you would make a distinction between staying engaged on issues, but disengaging from, we're using the example of the president here, disengaging from the president's antics when you feel a need.
Yeah, and to the extent you can at least balance some of that. And I'll give you one example, and it's something called cognitive behavior therapy. What we'll often do with depressed people is we know they first of all orient too much to negative things versus positive, and then they continue to ruminate on the negative events. One of the very simple therapies is to say, you know what, at the end of each day, I want you to write down 3 positive things that happened to you today. And that's all I want you to write down. That's all I care about. So if the person just has to do that, now as they go through the day, first of all, they're a little bit more mindful about the events that are happening. They're perhaps noting the positive events. They're perhaps thinking, okay, that's something I can write down at the end of the day. And so if we can rebalance the thoughts in their mind, we literally have an effect on the symptoms. We can change their thinking, change their attention. And so I think we all have to kind of do that to ourselves as well. Engage to the point we can be informed and feel empowered. But when it's situations that when it does start to, just feel like I can't watch this guy anymore, or I can't look at that anymore, you probably shouldn't.
Let's do the climate change example. If you feel particularly connected to what's going on in Australia these days, maybe you visited the place, maybe you've got family or friends there, and you see what's happening, how difficult is it to, at the end of the day, say, okay, I did see 3 positive things today, even though this entire continent is going up in flames and it's overwhelming me?
Yeah, it does become difficult. Of course it does. I think that everyone is going to deal with these situations in different ways. And I think that it is really trying to find that space of self-preservation, of caring for yourself as well and maintaining your own well-being. And how we do that is going to look different. I feel as though, for me personally, it is about taking a deep dive and really looking and engaging in on that topic area. But I know what my tools are to keep me well along the way. I often read the popular press, and then I'll look at the good news side of things, seeing, what's happening in Australia in terms of there's a photographer who's gone and taken some photographs of some emerging biodiversity that even after all of the wildfire devastation, he's taking some snapshots of some greenery that's coming up and posting it as a good news story so that people can also engage on the topic area, but also have some semblance of hopefulness and a sense of reemergence as well. And I think that that's really important, is to have that balance and to know what those networks are for you and to know your networks of care, because that's ultimately going to be what supports us through many of these difficult emotions.
I was debating with myself whether or not to ask you, given how much time you spend professionally and personally on the climate change issue, how do you get out of bed every day knowing that, knowing everything that you know about how desperate the situation is right now? So that's one trick you have.
Yes.
Are there many others as well?
Well, I think it's important. So in my research, I don't only focus on what are the risks and impacts. I don't only focus on the negative. What are the grand issues of our time, but what are we doing about it? That's always been a focal point of my research, is looking at what's being done at the community level, what's being done at the policy level, because I think that's where we also need to focus on. So much in any of the communications that I provide is saying, yes, we need to be alarmed, but we need to pair any messages of alarm and risk with what we can do about it, because we don't want to leave people in a hopeless state or in a helpless state.
No, I hear you, but, and Steve, let me go to you on this. The issue of control. These are the stories we talked about here, US, Iran, and the Australian bushfires. These are 2 stories for which the average person in this country undoubtedly feels they have zero influence, zero control. And even Australians, I suspect, who I think the stats are contribute to fossil fuel burning to the tune of 1.3% of the world's problems. Even they feel that this is an issue that's beyond their control. How does one kind of capture a sense of control?
I think it's important to get a sense of things that are or not. Like I would love, that time when I've lost the guy's name, Elon Musk, I guess, launched the rocket with the car. That brief little point where the car's going through space was this aspirational moment that I hadn't felt, I don't think, since the moon landing, when I was a very young child. And I think the environmental crisis, for example, has the potential. I haven't quite seen humans take that on yet and say, we embrace the impossible. And they say it's impossible to reverse this. Well, let's take that as a challenge and let's attack that. With that sort of mentality, you can deal with the problem. As she says, look at what are people trying to do? What's working? What's not working? That at least is doing something. With a lot of the geopolitical stuff, that's a very different can of worms. And so, I kind of see those as two different things. I agree with you that in most cases we feel powerless in both, but I wonder if we need to feel powerless in the environmental one, whereas the other...
I wonder if our despondency hasn't reached a level. I was 9 years old when the moonshot happened, right? When they landed on the moon? Yep. Okay, and you're right, the hopefulness in the air was just, and for us, of course, only 2 years after Expo, it was a very good time to be Canadian and a citizen of the world. Yeah. But I can remember when, was it Vice President Biden suggested we got to go to Mars next? Yeah. And people laughed. Yeah. Like the notion of the big project to steer us in a positive direction seemed so beyond the capabilities that people laughed at it. Is that where we're at nowadays?
It does. We hear that the town square has disappeared, kind of things, that everybody's become polarized. Certainly we live in a world now where if you believe something that's kind of odd or strange, you used to come into contact with others and you used to have to defend that position on a regular basis. And now you can find others who believe whatever it is you believe, and you can hang out with those. And a lot of people are doing that, and that's making it hard for people, I think, to have rational interactions about stuff and to work in collaborative ways. There's one of the famous examples from psychology is the Robbers Cave experiment, where it was about prejudice, but it really emphasized the power of a common enemy to bring people together. And every now and then something like the environmental issue is a common enemy. We're not saving the planet. The planet will be fine. We're saving us. It's us, yeah. It's our position that we hold in this planet. And so, if we can ever come to that as this is really, it's unclear how serious does it have to get before this happens, but at some point I think it will happen. It will be the common enemy, and it will have the potential to bring people together. It's
not a bad point. The planet ultimately, if we're gone, is going to be, the planet will be here. It's us who will be gone. Okay, that's our editorial for the day. At the end of the day, Katie, do we just have to accept the fact that there are some things out there that are beyond our control? We can't do a damn thing about them, and we just have to, A, learn to cope, and B, suck it up?
That's one way to look at it.
Well, two ways, actually.
There's two ways to look at it. I think there are many ways to look at it. I think that I still believe strongly that there are levers of change that we still need to really address and to pull on those levers. And I think we're seeing a lot of strength and a lot of leadership from the youth-led movement on climate change, for example. And for me, at the end of the day, that's what gets me up in the morning, is to understand and to see the power, the vigor, the conviction that is coming out of the youth leadership on this, and really demanding change in a new way. And I think that that's a really important lever that we still need to pull, and we need to be allies in this as well. So in terms of, at the end of the day, do we just kind of go, well, that's not the position I take.
No, that's tempting. It's tempting to take that position.
It's absolutely tempting. It's tempting. I think it stops being tempting when it's at our front door. When we are in the midst of, the wildfires that are taking shape in Australia, when we're in the midst of something, it becomes much harder to ignore. And I think, in particular, we need to really address that the populations that are most at risk are those who are already experiencing injustice and inequities. And it's an existential crisis of our time to really see these events taking shape. But it's also a point for us to be really reflexive and to understand what our role is in addressing these issues.
Why don't we leave this on that very hopeful note? That seems like a good spot to leave it. Katie Hayes, climate change and mental health researcher. Steve Jordan's professor of psychology, University of Toronto, Scarborough. Great to have both of you here at TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.